Vladimir Komarov and the new SOYUZ rocket were launched in the pre-dawn hours of April 23, 1967. The Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, was personally putting tremendous pressure on everyone at the space agency to launch this new SOYUZ spacecraft in time for the 50th anniversary of the Communist Revolution celebration. Posters were readied for schools and government offices, showing Komarov in his crisp military uniform with his shiny medals. However, the guidance system shorted out. The solar panels failed to deploy properly, and Komarov's capsule was losing electrical power and going out of control as a result. Komarov's capsule hit the Earth at 600 miles an hour, exploding and almost disintegrating on impact. There was no hope for Komarov's survival. Recent developments and brand new declassified evidence now clearly show that there's much, much more than meets the public eye about the secret life and death of Colonel Vladimir Komarov. Ever since the beginning of the space race, accidents and failures and human errors were never ever admitted in the Soviet Union. When they did occur, they were completely covered up, erased from existence by the propaganda machine of the totalitarian Soviet regime. Perhaps the most outrageous, egregious cover-up of the era was when a brand new ICBM was about to be tested.
It was the commander of strategic rocket forces, Marshal Nedelin, who feeling that you can do everything. So he bring his chair and he sat under the rocket that was at that time filled with fuel oxidizer and sitting there. So all other people gathering around, there was hundreds of people. They started the engine on the second stage. It is burned the first stage, and it is 160 tons of this oxidized fuel. Just it was like waterfall, oxidizer fall on top of all these people. It was like a hell, because they burnt alive. From the Marshal Nedelin, they found only his keys from his safe.
No one ever knew about this disaster, which killed not only Nedelin, head of the rocket strategic forces, but also over 165 military officers and technicians. The Soviet propagandists only allowed the newspapers to publish this one short communiqué on October 26, 1960, bylined from the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which said, quote, "Marshal Nedelin died in an airplane crash," end quote.
It was many such spectacular failures in the Soviet launches. Russia all the time kept their secrecy. It is part of the national mentality and part of the philosophy. So it was something between mentality and KGB logic. It just they don't like to expose all the things, as it was no democracy, there was no independent media, so nobody can make this discovery.
Cosmonaut training was conducted under the absolute strictest veil of secrecy, in a city specifically built for their living and training, off limits to any non-military personnel.
Many of the cosmonaut trainees were not necessarily from the Air Force Academy, and it wasn't only test pilots that became cosmonaut trainees. For example, Yuri Gagarin was not a test pilot at all. He was just a young pilot chosen from an air squadron in a remote base in the north with only a few hours of flight time. On the other hand, there were also some well-established test pilots chosen to be in the cosmonaut corps. that were all highly regarded, like Vladimir Komarov.
Any trainees who dropped out or who died during training were erased from existence, literally, airbrushed out of photographs, and any evidence of them destroyed, just like those victims of the Nedelin disaster. Not even parents, wives, or children were allowed to be aware of what their son or husband or father was doing.
It's been well over 50 years since the beginnings of the space race and the secrecy behind all the cosmonaut training and the efforts to get them into space. I find it fascinating that just recently the newspaper Pravda, the quasi-official media outlet of the Russian government, admitted for the very first time that 3 cosmonauts, Ledovsky, Shaborin, and Mitkov, that they were killed in early efforts to get into space on the suborbital flights, and that their names as heroes should now be recognized. That was an amazing revelation, but it does beg the question, what else has the government and the space agency kept secret, and what other lies have they told us over the years?
When the word went out that pilots were sought for the dangerous venture of space travel, by far the best and most famous Soviet test pilot of that era was Colonel Vladimir Ilyushin. In December of 1960, Colonel Vladimir Ilyushin was even awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, the highest Soviet award, equal to America's Congressional Medal of Honor.
Vladimir Ilyushin was a test pilot, one of the best test pilots of his generation. He was son of the famous Russian aircraft designer Sergei Ilyushin, who designed the Ilyushin II, the combat plane, named Shturmovik, the Second World War, and then the many passenger plane, Ilyushin bombers.
In Russia, there's a group of families who are significant historically, and the Ilyushins were certainly one of those. And the fact that it was all in the same sphere in aviation and aerospace sciences was significant. It was therefore, in my view, no accident that Vladimir Ilyushin would have been picked as the man for the job. I mean, it was an obvious choice. He was the right age, he had the right training, he had the name.
I had seen a photograph of Vladimir Ilyushin wearing space gear and referred to as a member of the cosmonaut group, training for cosmonaut. Therefore, when I heard the story that Vladimir Ilyushin had been up in space, it fitted.
Минутная готовность. Я Кербер, вас понял, минутная готовность.
The documents made available to me from the CIA and the U.S. Air Force tracking station Turn Island in the Pacific, they conclusively seem to indicate that not only was Vladimir Ilyushin launched on April 7th, 1961, but he seems to have had severe problems during that flight. Now, I'm not sure whether there was a failure of the guidance system or perhaps a malfunctioning thruster causing the ship to spin uncontrollably and maybe causing Ilyushin to black out, but from my interpretation of the data, he apparently missed the re-entry spot after the first orbit. Seems to have come down after 3 orbits. The orbital dynamics of the Earth's rotation would have put Ilyushin's re-entry in mainland China after 3 orbits.
It was not even within the realm of possibility for the Soviet press to tell the truth about what happened to Colonel Ilyushin. The inept accounts about his whereabouts on April 7, 1961, were hilarious, as laughable as a sitcom.
The Soviet Union was its own worst enemy as regards propaganda. I don't believe, I never believed, that the story that Soviet Union was good at propaganda. It was not. The confused stories about Ilyushin simply demonstrate the point that I've made several times, that the Soviet Union was its own worst enemy. That talk of Soviet propaganda being efficient, effective, is just nonsense.
At that time, in the beginning of the 1960s, it was very possible to cover up just about anything, including a rocket launch, because the propaganda was everywhere and all media was strictly controlled by the Kremlin. Everything that wasn't official was completely covered up. Launches at that time and flights could easily have been covered up and were covered up when they failed. For Russia, it was not a problem at all to cover something up.
Amidst all the confusion and controversy swirling around Colonel Ilyushin's aborted mission, and during a time when some began whispering about claims of cover-ups and conspiracies, young Lieutenant Yuri Gagarin was secretly and hurriedly named to be the first man in space.
Трудно из 6 выделить кого-либо одного, но такое решение нужно было принять.
It's difficult to single out any one of 6 splendidly trained astronauts, but that must be done. The Air Force Command recommends Senior Lieutenant Yuri Gagarin for the first spaceflight, and it has decided to appoint Herman Titov as backup pilot.
This was on the very next day after Colonel Ilyushin's failed flight. There was a highly secretive closed-door meeting with top military officials, told at the last minute to gather, oddly, immediately the next day, which was on a Saturday, April 8, 1961.
Разрешите, товарищи, мне заверить наше советское правительство.
Allow me to assure the Soviet government, Communist Party, and people that I'll carry out with honor the task entrusted to me, and that I'll be able to overcome all difficulties I may encounter the way a communist should.
Провожу первую дорогу в космос. А если на пути встретятся какие-либо трудности, то я преодолею их, как преодолевают коммунисты.
Very suspiciously, only 4 days after being officially named the next first man in space by the Soviet space officials on April 12, 1961, the strictly controlled Soviet media reported the successful launch, orbit, and re-entry of the first man in space, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. Although there still remains some doubts as to whether he actually flew the mission and whether he had already returned to Earth before the media broadcast the information about his flight. In any event, he was immediately brought to Moscow, paraded in front of huge cheering crowds as a returning conquering hero of the Soviet Empire, demonstrating the superior technology of communism over Western capitalist societies.
Любое новое задание нашей партии и правительства. Майор Гагарин.
The Soviets were now on top of the biggest story of the century. They had their handsome, youthful, enthusiastic member of the Communist Party, one who they could present to the world as the conquering hero of the Soviet Socialist Empire.
The general public reaction was one of tremendous enthusiasm, spontaneous enthusiasm, with crowds, as when Gagarin drove in with Khrushchev from Vnukovo airport. The streets were indeed lined with thousands of people who were absolutely enthusiastic, with homemade posters and banners and goodness knows what. They were really swept away.
I would say that Gagarin became the icon of my father's achievements. He became the representative of the Soviet Union with his nice smile and the face. And you have this idol in the countries all the time. It was like Elvis Presley to the United States later. You cannot pick them and say you will be the icon. People have to pick them and say you are the icon.
Gagarin may have been, at least at first, a willing participant, but he must also have started to figure out by then that their plan would be for him to spend the rest of his years as a fraud. After all, to party members, it was the communist society, communist government, and court of international opinion on communist perception that came first, far above any individual's needs or wants. Living the life of a lie, Gagarin was also showing signs of severe alcoholism and depression, mood swings worsening throughout his travels during these busy years. The media spin doctors were busy too, their lives in a state of denial, trying hard to conjure up stories to offer explanations for Yuri Gagarin's increasingly peculiar behavior. Furthermore, the government grounded Gagarin, absolutely prevented him from flying jets or going back into space, not allowing him to do anything dangerous, since the government's most prized possession had to be protected at all costs. Perhaps Gagarin's knowing he was a fraud, living a lie, combined with his entanglement in the Soviet PR machinery, and then being told he's denied the green light to ever fly again, all this started to really wear on Gagarin's psyche. Until mid-1964, Khrushchev's position as party leader was still secure, and Gagarin was forced by the Communist Party to continue his goodwill tours worldwide, promoting the ideals of the socialist way. However, the Soviet Union's mounting economic problems increased the pressure on Khrushchev's leadership, and Khrushchev's administration was also continuing to spend an increasingly untenable amount of money funding the space race, instead of modernizing the conventional military forces. On October 14, 1964, while Khrushchev was away on holiday in the Crimea, there was a bloodless coup. His protege, Leonid Brezhnev, took over and became the Russian Communist Party's first secretary, with the support and approval of the military.
An interesting subplot to all these political dynamics going on at the time in the Soviet Union was on October 12, 1964. The USSR launched the world's first multi-manned spacecraft, Voskhod-1. It was the first to carry 3 people into space, commanded by Yuri Gagarin's best friend, Colonel Vladimir Komarov. Now, this was a highly dangerous modification to the capsule and considered as a very risky stunt back then in order to upstage the American space flights, because all 3 men could not wear spacesuits in the cramped capsule, and there was no ejection seats or escape tower. The bravery and heroism of these 3 men to go into space without spacesuits and taking all kinds of risks certainly is unheard of these days.
And they was launched and greeted by Khrushchev, and then the Khrushchev talked with them by telephone. But when they returned to the Earth, they was met with the new leadership. And they have the joke, usually they reported to Khrushchev and told, in future we'll fulfill orders of the Soviet government. And now they joke that they report, we will fulfill any orders of any Soviet government.
As soon as Brezhnev became leader, he developed an increasingly conservative and regressive attitude, especially towards Yuri Gagarin, who found he was suddenly given the cold shoulder. Gagarin was abruptly frowned upon by the new regime, especially because he was seen by them as a symbol of a Khrushchev accomplishment. Gagarin was rapidly approaching the limit that he could tolerate. of having his entire life under governmental control. He was ready to quit the Cosmonaut Corps and the Air Force and take his chances doing anything else. Gagarin's public overuse of alcohol, visible depression, and mood swings were getting more and more noticeable and more difficult to control. At that point, the head of the space program, Sergei Korolyov, saw a need to step in. Korolyov promised Gagarin that he'd get him back on board a flight, that he'd use every ounce of his power to make sure Gagarin got another chance to go back into space on the newly developed SOYUZ spaceship scheduled for launch in 1967. However, on January 14, 1966, Sergei Korolyov went into a Moscow hospital for a routine minor surgical procedure. A malignant tumor was discovered, and Korolyov died on the operating table. With the death of Korolyov also went the promise to send Gagarin back into space. Korolyov had never groomed a protege, nor did he have any candidates for a strong-willed successor who could easily take over for him. The new leaders ultimately decided to have Gagarin's best friend, Vladimir Komarov, fly on the maiden voyage of the new SOYUZ instead. They did, however, give permission to Gagarin to be Komarov's backup.
Let's say when we're talking about Gagarin, the SOYUZ and the Komarov, they were very different people. Komarov was a much more experienced person, and I think he was much older than Gagarin. But he has his personal friends with whom he went hunting, or went to watch the soccer game or hockey or have the party.
There seems to be no question from the documents I've seen that Yuri Gagarin and Vladimir Komarov were the absolute best of friends and really did love each other like brothers. I'm quite sure that Gagarin saw Komarov as the proverbial big brother he never had. I'm also sure that no one in the space agency in the post-Korolyov era had the guts to let Gagarin risk his life on another space mission, but that putting these two cosmonauts together on this maiden flight of the SOYUZ was the next best scenario.
Everybody already knew that Gagarin was grounded, never to fly again. But this was a way to keep him thinking he was active in the Cosmonaut Corps, at least for the time being. Since this was to be the maiden flight of the first newly designed rocket in the post-Korolyov era, the space agency set up a highly complex mission involving two SOYUZ spacecraft being sent up at roughly the same time, and involving a total of 4 cosmonauts, along with a double spacewalk and transfer of cosmonauts from one ship to the other. Gagarin and Komarov demanded they be the ones to test and inspect every aspect of this new spacecraft and capsule. During their inspection, both Gagarin and Komarov found several design flaws with many of the switches and wiring, which would most certainly lead to a catastrophic failed mission if this problem occurred in space. The Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, was personally putting tremendous pressure on everyone at the space agency to launch this new SOYUZ spacecraft in time for the 50th anniversary of the Communist Revolution celebration. This resulted in the space agency being either unable or unwilling to accept Gagarin's and Komarov's claim of design flaws and potential failures. Gagarin and Komarov even went so far as to write a personal letter to Brezhnev, appealing to him to not use the spacecraft, detailing its more than 200 problems and requesting that the flight be postponed. That letter was personally delivered to the Kremlin, but the letter mysteriously disappeared shortly afterwards. Once again, Gagarin stood toe-to-toe with the inflexible and impersonal Soviet machinery that cared less about saving the life of his best friend and more about the image of the great empire. time was running out for Komarov. Of the 4 unmanned test launches of the SOYUZ before Komarov's flight, all 4 were failures, having exploded on the launch pad or shortly after launch. Therefore, Gagarin and Komarov came up with one last chance plan to stop the insanity of this mission. The strategy was to create a huge scandal in the space community just 2.5 days before Komarov's flight, during a meeting with Communist Party members, space agency dignitaries, and official government-approved reporters and photographers in a news conference-style setting. It was a formality presenting cosmonauts to the officials in this setting and go through a few rounds of questions and answers. Both Gagarin and Komarov believed that if these people were to find out the truth about this badly planned mission, then surely they would put a stop to it and save not only Komarov's life, but the other cosmonauts in the second capsule as well. So it was decided by Gagarin and Komarov that during the meeting, Komarov would tell the truth about the mission, which he did. The audience was expecting simple, routine statements, but instead saw Komarov stand up and bluntly warn about several design flaws, how the spaceship was not at all ready for launch, and that the flight would be a suicide mission if he flew on schedule. The audience, completely shocked, was totally taken by surprise at Komarov's brutal honesty. However, rather than the officials expressing sympathy for Komarov's cause and demanding an investigation, there was complete silence. Then one of the leading Communist Party officers stood up and told Komarov point blank that he was a coward, one not worthy of the uniform he was wearing. These were fighting words to a test pilot and cosmonaut hero like Vladimir Komarov. Both Gagarin and Komarov knew at that point that all was lost, and that their last attempt to stop the madness had failed. Komarov looked up at all assembled and responded, quote, "I am ready to fly at any time and on any day," end quote.
For someone like Vladimir Komarov to have the guts to go into space without a spacesuit, then to be called a coward for not wanting to go on a suicide mission, that certainly must have put him over the top. I've seen a report where Komarov's friends admitted that Komarov laid out all the details of his impending flight and the dangers involved to his wife. The wife was reported to have told him to refuse to go, and his response was that if he refused to go, then Brezhnev would send Gagarin up in his place, and it would be him that would surely die. Komarov really thought that was unacceptable and felt that Gagarin needed protecting.
Gagarin himself made several frantic last-minute appeals for a personal meeting with Brezhnev. He also placed several angry calls to Kremlin officials, but all his meeting requests were refused. Brezhnev wanted the new spaceship launched on April 23, 1967, and no one was willing or able to stand up to Leonid Brezhnev.
Some years later, one of the technicians preparing Komarov on launch day told a reporter that Gagarin was becoming totally irrational in the preparation room about 3 or 4 hours before the launch where Komarov was suiting up, and that Gagarin was flailing his arms around, demanding a spacesuit, demanding that he wasn't going to let Komarov go up by himself, insisting he was going to go up with Komarov by his side. From this report, Gagarin completely lost it, practically had to be restrained to let Komarov go up the gantry to the capsule. It must have been a really difficult situation for everybody at the time, especially Gagarin, to watch Komarov go on practically a suicide mission.
Komarov and the new SOYUZ rocket were launched in the pre-dawn hours of April 23, 1967. However, just as Gagarin and Komarov predicted, the equipment failures began almost immediately. The guidance system shorted out, the solar panels failed to deploy properly, and Komarov's capsule was losing electrical power and going out of control as a result. These massive and immediate failures, at the very least, prevented the launching of the second SOYUZ spacecraft, sparing those 3 cosmonauts. Komarov switched all systems to manual controls, and he was thus able to orient his capsule properly for re-entry in the very narrow entry corridor at the soonest possible opportunity, and to line up his re-entry thrusters to slow his speed. Gagarin had demanded to be the capsule communicator with Komarov in the mission control room, and so he was able to be with his best friend up until the final moments of re-entry. In reality, Komarov exhibited his superior test pilot talents in getting the SOYUZ capsule under control and through the narrow re-entry corridor, but the batteries were exhausted by the time of re-entry, and there was just no power left to deploy the parachutes to slow the capsule down. Komarov's capsule hit the Earth at 600 miles an hour, exploding and almost disintegrating on impact when the fuel for the re-entry thrusters ignited. There was no hope for Komarov's survival. Gagarin hopped on the next plane out to the landing site, which happened to be a cargo aircraft, to see for himself what had happened. Once there, he found a still smoldering crater filled with twisted and melted wreckage, along with the burnt-up bits and pieces of what was left of his best friend. Traumatized by what he had seen, Gagarin himself started to go through the wreckage, picking up the pieces of what was his best friend, and ordered as much of Komarov's earthly remains as could be readily located to be placed into a casket, and were immediately escorted back to Moscow by Gagarin and other military officers that same day. The strictly controlled Soviet media was in a complete quandary about covering Komarov's flight failure, especially since the launch itself was widely reported with great fanfare and publicity. This situation was thus unlike the Nedelin disaster that killed so many people, or Ilyushin's failed flight, or all the other ill-fated and tragic cosmonaut trainee accidents. Those missions were not reported live while in progress, so they were reasonably easy to cover up, to destroy the evidence. However, in Komarov's case, reporters were live and the public was waiting near their TVs and radios to hear of the flight's progress since the early morning. But the Soviet news media totally ignored any mention of the flight for the whole rest of the day, almost as if there was never any flight at all.
The whole of the press corps was absolutely on edge. Furthermore, Moscow was a mass of rumours. Moscow was always full of rumours about all kinds of things, but at this time it was about space. And there were several different versions of the story. Some of them were published in the West. We were constantly exchanging phone calls. Have you heard this? Have you heard that? And what do you think of it?
Komarov's wife, Valentina, immediately knew that her husband was dead when she didn't hear anything on the radio or TV about her husband's flight, and also when she realized that the KGB cut off her telephone line during the day, presumably to prevent her from hearing about his death until she was officially notified. A group of generals pulled up to her driveway later that day, and gave her both good news and bad news. The good news, as told by the generals, was that her husband had heroically survived both the flight and landing, and the mission itself was a big success. But the bad news was that he died in a hospital as a result of burns he sustained in a bus crash in the city of Sholkovo, just outside of Moscow, on the way back after the flight. That was how the Soviet media was preparing to report his death. The generals left Valentina with her husband's official death certificate as dictated by the Kremlin.
This is the scientific mission of communism, to reshape reality as a new social order and a new human being will arise. And so the PR strategy was naturally going to fit that end. And as I think more about it now, in thinking about the logic of the system as it confronts the bad news, it makes perfect sense that they would have reshaped the reality of it to suit their own needs and to project a different story to the world. It was all justified.
The Soviet Union was useless at propaganda. There was never an accident, there was never a mishap. The picture was of perfection. But what the Soviet propagandists did not understand was that by presenting the difficulties, the problems, the mistakes, the accidents, the mishaps, they could have presented a far better picture of the Soviet Union than in fact they did. And, showed a completely inept approach.
Valentina immediately called up Yuri, who just returned from the crash site. She was in hysterics, asking him what to do with such a document since, as she was reported to have said, quote, "Except for the first and last name of my husband on this document, I'm sure not a single other word was true." End quote.
Юрий, Валентина, да. У меня только что в доме были генералы. Они мне сказали, что все они обманули. Все, что осталось, это вот это имя. Все обман, все, что они сказали.
The logic of the system was that everything presented to the outside world had to express the purity and perfection of Marxist-Leninist thinking. And this was a fixation at the highest levels, and it permeated down. So everybody was willing to participate in lying as a national pastime, and lying to themselves, lying to their families, lying in their communities, lying to the outside world, because there was a greater purpose, which was that they, as the better system, had to win the Cold War.
So when the Soviet propagandists tried to cover up Vladimir Komarov's flight, exactly the way they tried to cover up the Nedelin disaster, and exactly like they tried to cover up the Ilyushin flight, it must have driven Gagarin over the edge, and he just must have lost control. I mean, the guy was already traumatized over seeing his best friend getting smashed to pieces on an unnecessary suicide mission. But then to have it brushed under the carpet and the world would be told that Komarov was killed in a bus crash, it was too much for Gagarin to bear. I've seen recently declassified State Department and CIA reports referring to Gagarin storming into the Kremlin, shouting, screaming, demanding to see Brezhnev, demanding the truth be told about Komarov. And he died a hero of the Soviet Union at the controls of a spaceship and not from some make-believe fire in a bus crash in Moscow. Gagarin apparently even threatened to go to the Western press himself if the Soviet media didn't immediately acknowledge Komarov's heroic death, and that it had nothing to do with the Marxist-Leninist communist philosophy, that it really was about doing the right thing for a true cosmonaut hero who sacrificed his life for his country.
So figuratively speaking, Gagarin and Brezhnev went eyeball to eyeball over what to do with Komarov's death. After all, the Marxist-Leninist communist philosophy was that of never admitting any failures or accidents, and never before in the 50-year history of the Soviet Union had any major accident or failure ever been reported and made public, especially not in the middle of the celebrations marking the 50th anniversary of the Communist Revolution. However, this one time, It was Brezhnev who figuratively blinked first. Brezhnev apparently backed down when confronted by Gagarin, the great hero and icon of the Soviet way of life. Only as a result of the sheer willpower of Gagarin did the Soviet media ultimately, if not reluctantly, report the death of Komarov as being a valiant death at the controls of his spacecraft, as a consequence of a tragic accident, and that he was a true Soviet hero.
Marxist-Leninist politics prided itself on being a scientific, objective analysis of human and natural law. And if you are really good at your Marxist-Leninist theory, then nothing in the real world should be less than perfect. So it was a great embarrassment not only to disclose this fact externally, but to have to admit it internally in the halls of power.
The propagandists did slightly adjust the cause of the accident, as well as failing to report all of the design flaws that Gagarin and Komarov found with the spacecraft in the first place that caused the accident. Komarov was ultimately given a tremendous hero's funeral. His ashes were placed in the Kremlin wall alongside other Soviet historical notables.
I never met Komarov because they did not invite me to any receptions after my father was ousted of power. But it was tragedy to all of us, it was big tragedy to my father.
One thing was for sure, that Brezhnev would not soon forget being stung by Gagarin on this day, and being embarrassed into admitting a major failure in Soviet technology. After Komarov's death, Gagarin's life was in a free fall, a tailspin. His behavior was becoming even more erratic and difficult for reporters to understand. Gagarin was making foolhardy statements like, quote, "I don't know if I was the last dog in space or the first man in space," end quote. There was no place to turn for Yuri Gagarin. There was bad blood between Gagarin and Brezhnev. He was becoming more and more an outcast in Brezhnev's government. By early 1968, Gagarin wasn't welcome at government functions, even though he grudgingly attended them. Internally, he must have known that he was never going to fly jets or go into space again, especially after what happened to Komarov.
I've seen at least 3 or 4 reports from the State Department that describe Gagarin getting drunk at a government function in early 1968, and that he actually threw a glass of champagne in the face of Brezhnev in front of a bunch of dignitaries. Now, I can just imagine that if Gagarin was becoming so disrespectful of the Soviet leadership that Brezhnev would have gone to the head of the KGB and told him that enough was enough and it was time to make Gagarin something other than a live embarrassment.
Then suddenly, Gagarin was sent an extremely odd message. He's allowed to fly in a jet again and allowed to re-qualify as a fighter jet pilot, although official records are quite vague as to who precisely authorized such a flight. He's sent up in a MiG jet for the very first time in 7 years on a so-called routine training mission. Then, on the very first day of the very first flight he takes, the jet suddenly, inexplicably crashes. And we're just told that Gagarin dies? Why was there no Mayday call? And why could neither he nor his co-pilot eject out when the jet experienced the engine failure? He just goes up, the jet crashes, and he dies? Bing bada boom? Goodbye, thank you very much? And bring the curtain down on the sad and short life of Yuri Gagarin. Huh? Nobody thinks that there's anything wrong with the picture here?
When we talk about the Gagarin death, it was mystery because nobody know what was happened. Of course, it was personal tragedy, it was national tragedy, it was world tragedy because we lost the man in his young age when he was a hero. But from the other side, it is leaving his image for the history. Maybe it was more in his interest that he leaving this young, smiling person.
I've reached the point in thinking about what the Soviet Union managed to pull off in the way of lies to the outside world, or lies to its own citizens, or lies to itself, not to be surprised that something like that might have occurred. If he was killed, it probably was because they didn't want somebody telling the story or being undisciplined about it. Unfortunately, we may never know whether he died of an accident or of a murder.
Well, it seems perfectly clear to me that Yuri Gagarin's death had the fingerprints of Leonid Brezhnev and the KGB all over it. And I see it started with Vladimir Komarov's death and Gagarin's confrontations with the Soviet leadership over how Komarov was killed. To me, I see this untold story of Vladimir Komarov and his death. It was more a story of true heroism. It was more of a story of a man who was willing to sacrifice himself to save his best friend. And for Yuri Gagarin, that he was willing to make a stand and risk his own life and reputation in confronting the Soviet leadership to do the right thing, honoring his friend's death. It would be fascinating to see what other stories and what other secrets come to life from the trickle of information now or in the future released from the Russian archives about the old space race.
Any society, whether it be capitalist, communist, totalitarian, or freely democratic, is doomed to failure and extinction if it's based on deceit and lies and secrecy, just like what happened to the old Soviet Union. I, for one, can't, in good conscience, sit back and allow or tolerate falsified history books, governmental cover-ups, and international conspiracies to continue without question. I feel we have planted a seed of questioning to begin to set the record straight about Vladimir Komarov and Yuri Gagarin and the practices and procedures of the old communist Soviet empire. I guess I leave history to the historians.